And you are live.
Thank you. So we'll call this meeting of the task force on elections to order. Thank you for joining us and looking around. All of the members of the task force are here except for Scott Gibson, but I think he'll be arriving shortly. And on our agenda tonight, we have a few items to discuss, the conversation with Jared about the ward boundaries committee work and what came out of that, and maybe some lessons learned that might be helpful to us. And then really digging into some of the topics we discussed at the work session in this forum, where we can sort of do a little bit of that on the record, as well as talking about the great survey that our colleagues have prepared and worked with the city staff to be in a position to push out and sort of figure out how, if anything, we can do to help do that, and sort of what the plan is on that. In addition, I think, Eileen, I made a note, it's not on the agenda, but I know we had an email exchange with Ashley about sort of, we probably have to take an official recommendation, right, to ask them to study the question in the Office of Law on sort of, whether things could be sent to referendum directly by the council, the question about, whether it should go to the ballot. So we'll get into that a little bit later. I guess we'll just sort of hang for a minute here and see if Jared is joining us. I'm happy to shoot him a note, but
you have a quorum. Do you want to go ahead and do the minutes?
Yes, absolutely. So you should have seen earlier today, Scott put together the minutes from the last meeting before the work session that have been distributed. So if anybody has a motion about the minutes, we'd be happy to entertain.
The agenda says May 10th, the 20th, and the 24th. I can't remember if they were approved or not. I came late.
We did those at the last meeting before the work session.
They were done. So it's just June 14th. Okay.
Exactly. Has anyone else had a chance to take a look at them? It should be in your email this afternoon. So.
Mr. Chair, I just sent Jared an email.
Thank you.
I move that the minutes of the June 14th meeting be approved with any necessary corrections.
Thank you. There a second?
Seconded.
Moved and seconded approval of the minutes. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everybody. Maybe we should talk about this while we wait for Jared. The issue, Eileen, if you want sort of the feedback from the Office of Law about sort of being on the record officially.
I think I mentioned at our work session that the ballot, the Charter Revision Commission had put forth the recommendation for ballot questions, and it had been just informally discussed, I think, at a Board of Elections meeting with Ashley. And the thought was that it might be possible for the city council to initiate a ballot question, because the code is pretty vague. So I did reach out to Ashley, and she requested that if this group wanted to get it, the best way moving forward would be to formally ask the Office of Law for an opinion on this question. So it would, I guess the most succinct would be, can a city council member, can the city council put a question on the ballot? And then that would go to them and be written as an opinion, which has a little bit more strength than just, discussing it in a meeting. So, but that would need to be a motion and approved from this group.
So yeah, I mean, I think unless anyone has any questions, it's just sort of the formal process to allow them to basically then sort of go dig and work on the question, which has never really been answered. It sounds like anytime recently about whether the council could refer
Regina
something.
Regina said to her memory, while she's been there, which is fairly long time,
Long
there's
time.
never been a question on the ballot. So it hasn't come up before. So, but Ashley's happy to follow up on it. She just needs a formal request.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, at least just from the conversation when we were all last together, right? If that's a thing we think we might want to recommend to them, it would be helpful to know if they can actually do it or not, right? So I think, so I just think it's probably a very straightforward, sort of, we can just sort of take a vote. So it's official in an open session here that we're going to sort of ask the Office of Law to do that process and come back with an opinion, which is, I mean, I think when we first talked about this a few meetings ago, what Scott was trying to do at that point. And now we've sort of back channel conversation and so this is where we're at. So if there's anyone has a recommendation, I'd be happy to entertain it to basically sort of have the task force officially go on the record to ask the Office of Law to do that. Or any debate or conversation about it before we jumping ahead.
How would we word it exactly?
Did she give you any sort of language?
Nothing specific. I think something, you could say something along the lines of request an opinion from the Office of Law on, I don't want to say guidance, but I guess the question is, can the city council put a ballot on the question? I mean, put a question on the ballot.
I mean, best case scenario, they just say yes, right? Wouldn't it kind of wouldn't it kind of be a little more efficient to say, can the, city council put this particular question on the ballot? And then we wouldn't have to, worry about whether our question is also legal. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of ways, not necessarily to expedite things, but to be more efficient in doing it.
Yeah, I think it's more just sort of a question because there's no one it hasn't been done, right? So the question,
Right.
And it's a pretty vague part of the code. I know there was, when I was on the council, there was talk about you could do it sort of via signatures and stuff like that. So groups are interested in trying to figure that out, but it's untested. Nobody in recent time has put anything on the ballot in the city. So the question is they would need to go actually do a little digging in the Office of Law and come up with an official opinion that they will then stand behind when someone on the council wants to do this for this or any other issue, right? So it's really just creating the sort of, sort of having that paper trail, I think is what she intends to do. So
Right.
it doesn't really even matter what sort of the question would be that the council would do. If they come back and they're no, the council can't directly refer, it only has to be done by signatures of people in the community, then that would be a different thing that we would need to take into consideration. So Andrew?
Yeah, no,
Right.
I get it.
You basically answered my point there. Yeah, I was just thinking, if when we do reach out to them, we probably want to get opinion on both, how the council can introduce that referendum, and as well how the community can through the signatures and that sort of thing. So we have a sense of how both pathways might work.
Well, I think there's two different, I think there's one, a short term, which is to make that to be able to make some specific recommendations in this report. The other is the broader one. And just like so many sections of the code, the larger one needs to be addressed also. So it's actually at this point, a simpler question to ask, can the city council do it? Until we write the code for the overall ballot process, because if we also defer to the state, it's actually pretty hard. We would need something you need, I think, 25% of not voters, but eligible registered voters. So it came out to be 8,000 when we looked up the number last time. So I would just, if you want to go down there, keep it separate, but I'm not sure the Office of Law can really, they can't legislate they can't really say what process we would want for the for the general voters or the general citizens to bring it forth. At least I don't think. I'm looking up the code now.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the code is vague, like that's where their opinion is going to provide some clarity. So, right, but they
Right.
may, by digging into it, may actually sort of look at both anyway. If that's how the code is, I haven't looked at that section of code in a long time, but
I mean, my understanding is, and I'm just refreshing a little bit with code here, it says that once it goes, it still goes to the city code, and then they actually have to prepare and certify the form in which the question should appear and how it's captioned and all of that, the basis of it. So it has some detail with that. But again, the question I think we have is, can they initiate it, or does it have to come from the general public with signatures?
yeah, I mean, your point's well taken, Andrew, because like really, like at the end of the day, like there could be multiple paths for this that there's not clarity really on, right? So like, but you know, in us as a group making recommendations to the council to do what they want to do with, be able to say like there's some clarity in an official opinion that the office of law will stand behind is probably the near term challenge. But
Yeah, that's totally fine by me if we want to just focus on the council side of it. I do wonder, and we don't need to raise this in the question, but I do wonder, like, is there a minimum threshold, like either via state law or federal law, in which, you know, you have to set the threshold for referendum at, say, like 5% of eligible voters. I have no idea if that exists, but at some point, maybe down the road, it might be worth looking into that if we do want to specify those numbers, that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
The city code does not get into that level of detail. And when we looked at it the last time and we went with what the state percentage was, it came out to something like we would need 8,000 signatures to get a question on the ballot. And this was raised in response to partisan versus nonpartisan, because over the years, we've had a number of people that have asked about it. And I guess in the last election, it came up, there was a group that asked, could they put a ballot question together? And we gave them that information, and then it didn't go anywhere. And I think the stumbling block was that it's all the voters, it's a pretty high percentage. And it's only gone up because we have more voters now too.
yeah, I mean, like it seems to me like in thinking about this more, like, I mean, the county has a process, right, where the county council can refer things to the ballot because they do have ballot questions often, right? So like, so the question, right, like this could be a thing, right? Like if the answer from the office of law is to the specific question of can the council do they have the authority to do that now the way the county council does, and the answer comes back yes, then we're clear to make a recommendation that they should use that power, right? Like if they don't, if the answer is no, they don't, then people on the council should be trying to sort of model something they can amend, a separate piece of legislation to amend that looks more like the county system if they want to have that authority. But like until the office of law answers the question as their office is and these things, there's sort of like people have different opinions, but there's no, it sort of creates the framework to then take an action, right? So like, which I mean, they probably, if it gets raised up to that point, people on the council, I know I would when I was there, be like, oh, we should have that power, right? Like this would be useful to do things with. So like I think to the core question of just the language, it would be just the task force is requesting an official opinion from the office of law about whether the city council can refer questions to the ballot in the city on the city ballot. Let me just write that down. Any other discussion or anyone like to make a motion to approve that request to the Office of Law?
Yeah, I move that we request an opinion from the Office of Law on whether or not the council can make put referendum on the ballot.
Or
Is there a
it's a
second?
ballot question. It's not a referendum, it's a ballot question. Is that okay?
Okay, I'm amending the motion to specify that it's a ballot question.
Great. Is there a second?
I second it.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Cool. So I haven't heard back from Jared, so I'm let's maybe we can talk about the survey and sort of what the plans are there, just for everyone's benefit, or if there's any clarity or anything you need us to do in an official capacity that would be helpful in the conversations with the city staff.
Yes, sorry to Andrew and Faye for all of the emails today, but I finally got some time to put it all out. So I did send out just an overall community outreach plan to everybody if there's any questions. And certainly Faye and Andrew, if you want to explain anything. I think we've made a fair amount of progress and have gotten a lot of assistance with city staff. So Mitchell Stevenson, City Information Officer Sean Wampler in MIT has been helping also behind the scenes, and then Hillary in Constituent Services is going to be pushing it out for us, and then certainly Regina's also been helping.
That's great. Yeah, it looks great. So Hillary's identifying those sort of groups, organizations, and sharing it with.
It was greatly expanded. It's on the website, and I think I'd sent it out, the organizations and groups, and certainly we can add additional ones. But
Perfect.
my understanding from Mitchell is that she'll target it, but they'll send it out, so it'll come out from the city.
Perfect. That's great.
And then just also of note, if people have questions, the contact person in City Hall will be Regina in the office of the city clerk. And then requests and questions can be sent to elections@annapolis.gov. And then when she gets them, she plans to shoot them out to, I imagine just the subcommittee, probably Andrew, Faye, or myself, and just, follow up on that.
Great.
I mean, one of the questions to kind of look at this is we're looking at launching it on July 24th.
Yep.
And we hadn't really talked too much about how long we want it to run. So I don't know if you all want to give some feedback on how long, because we do want to save some time for actually pulling together all the information and then presenting it to you all. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is sort of and it dovetails with another issue I've been thinking about. Like, it's like I'm sure people will be traveling as we get deeper into the summer, and sort of like, what sort of our meeting schedule, and I was going to sort of propose, is there some utility in sort of taking off a meeting while we wait for some of the responses to come in, and then sort of be able to be on the other side of that. Do you have a thought of sort of how long from the 24th forward you would think would be a strategic time to have it available to the public?
Andrew, do you recall if Mitchell made a recommendation? I don't have anything written down.
I don't recall a recommendation.
Yeah, I don't think she did. Yeah, I mean, my sense of it, or my opinion, is that the most responses are gonna be in like the first like few days, really, like when you kind of push it out, you post it on social media, that sort of thing. But so I would say like maybe between 1 and 2 weeks or something like that, maybe as a place to start about it. But yeah, I think usually that should be sufficient, but I'm open to like other ideas on that.
Yeah, I was gonna say 2 weeks.
I think 2 weeks is pretty reasonable, and sometimes it's helpful actually just to post the deadline and say, we will be
Exactly.
accepting,
It's gonna close the window.
accepting responses up until a certain date. Because otherwise people will procrastinate or forget about it. So if we made it, let me look at the count. The next technical meeting or the meetings in August for this group would be the 9th and the 23rd. So if we did the 24th and we did 2 weeks, then it would end on the 7th. And then we would have 2 weeks to kind of pull it all together and then present it at the meeting on the 23rd. That's one scenario.
Any thoughts on, I mean, that timeline makes sense to me. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Like you know, we're going to see probably the most response when it's first hits, and then by putting a deadline on it, maybe you get some people who respond near the end as it gets circulated. So,
All right, so
Sounds like a good plan.
7th, yay, nay?
Are we concerned that there are going to be enough respondents? Like, is there a certain point where we should say that it's a wash if there isn't enough interest? Or do we extend the deadline if that's the case?
Maybe we could cross that bridge when we get there.
Okay.
No, I mean, it's a reasonable.
Well,
We could make it we could say the week of August 7th, if you want to have a few more days and not make it a hard deadline.
I think a hard deadline's fine. I just want to know, like, you know.
Yeah, I would think if we get to that point, maybe a week, because people do go on vacation in the summer. And sometimes it doesn't hurt to give them another week. But I would start off with the 2 week time period, and then if necessary, so at least we have a plan in case we don't get a lot of responses. But we're trying to flood everybody's emails with it, and with the posters and everything, and the different community centers and everything. So hopefully, and we're sending it to all the alderpersons and asking them to make sure that their constituents get a copy of it. And so hopefully they will push it out as well. And word of mouth, hopefully.
So we could just make it that Friday, the 11th, if you want. That gives a little. Scott, we're talking about making a deadline for getting the questionnaire responses back.
I apologize for being late. I thought I had enough time to get from the office to home, and I was wrong.
So
yeah,
the
we're
7th
sort
or
of
the
digging into
11th?
the.
What are people thinking?
It's a non-scientific survey, so I'm not worried about. I mean, more participation is always better, but knowing that the results are non-scientific because it's not a randomized sample, it's not. You take it with a grain of salt anyway. So I didn't sweat the deadline too much, honestly.
Okay. All right, well, I'll put the 7th down. We can always check and get some feedback from Mitchell and see if she has any feelings about it. But we should be on target for sending it out on the 24th. I don't know if you have any other some other specific information people are interested. We talked about, originally we had talked about doing something through Google, and it just turned out to be
Google Form sort of thing.
it just turned out to be too
Couldn't handle it.
expensive. And so we're going with, and correct me if I'm saying these things wrong. So we're looking at something called Survey 123, which is a geospatial platform that Sean Wampler and MIT can manage. And so those geographically in the city can answer it. So that does mean that if someone's in the city, even if they're not an Annapolitan, they can answer it, but there is a, one of the questions is in there, helps us indicate if somebody is an Annapolitan or not. One of the advantages with the survey 123 is that we can collect some additional information. We can still get the link out to social media, and we can still also supplement it with buying some Google ads. And I know that Regina has put in a request to the Office of Law for some funding for Google ads and also to provide an incentive. So Mitchell had recommended we think about, gift cards. So if you finish this survey or finish the questionnaire, your name will be included in, in a drawing for gift cards. People don't have to put in their names and emails, but they are given the opportunity to if they want to at the end of it. Talked about pushing it out.
And they're gonna, so it sounds like they're gonna put some money behind that. They have the ability to do that.
Well, we thought we had some before, but it didn't work out because it was the end of the year. So we should be able to. It would be within the Office of Law. So the request has been made to Mike Lyles.
Gotcha.
That's money be made available.
That's great.
So I think we're on a roll. I mean, we're going to do social media, the e-blast mail. Mitchell's going to create some posters with a QR code, and we've looked at putting some of them out. If people have other sites that they want to recommend for putting them out, but just to get the word out, and hopefully people will come forth. We also talked about the National Night Out is August 1st, and the Office of Emergency Management will be, I think, setting up tables at 3 sites. And so we could think about asking them if they would also post the posters and also maybe have some of the paper copies available, but we haven't moved forward in that part yet, but that's on the list. So, we tried with the survey to kind of encompass a lot of the major questions that that we've been talking about: voting methods, primary elections, syncing the elections, non-citizen residents being able to register to vote, same day voter registration, the voting age being lowered, and term limits. So, we could probably add easily another 10, but I think we did a good job of whittling it down to those 10. And there is a comment section.
I think it's great. I mean, that's the hardest thing probably, is to land on 10, right? If you're going to try to, so
Right. Yeah.
other things you could ask, but that's awesome.
Great.
Sure, Scott.
There's only, and I completely respect the challenge of getting to 10 questions. There's only one question that dawned on me that may be really useful to ask. And that is are you under 18 question? Because knowing how that cross tabulates with the voting age question could be worthwhile.
Okay. We might be able to handle that in terms of collecting data outside of the questionnaire.
Yeah. But just anything we could get on Insight, because if there's a correlation between the overwhelming yeses are coming from 17-year-olds, and I think that would be useful to know.
Right. Well, and Mitchell also did tell us, things like going through Facebook and most of the social media platforms now, you're going to get an older crowd unless you move towards some that younger groups are using.
Yeah.
Which she's not signed up for some of those. So
Yeah, it's like they know they're getting a smaller and smaller sliver of people, but they also are not on the other platforms they need to reach other people, right? So
right. What's the new one? Threads?
Yeah. I don't think we're even legally allowed to use TikTok, or that just might be a state issue.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, she'll push it out as best that she can and redo it. She also did some neat artwork to go along with it, and some graphics. So that'll be great. Any other questions?
Thank you for all of your work on this and putting this together, and all of you who took the time to drill down on this. I think it sounds great from my perspective, and thank you for all investing the extra time into doing this. So, JM or Scott, any other questions since we haven't been as deeply involved as our colleagues in this effort? Like, any other thoughts?
No, thank you.
You're welcome. It was a collective effort between Andrew and Faye and myself.
It's awesome. And we don't need to do anything official to endorse anything or so. Like, it's all, everything's ready
I
to
think we
roll.
said we weren't going to necessarily need to approve it, that you all said that we could move forward.
Yep.
I think Regina would feel better if there was a vote on maybe the overall communication plan, which covers everything, if you want to go that route, but that's up to you all. She's not here.
It never hurts to just record a motion.
Yeah.
So for that purpose, I'll move that we support the survey and the communication plan that was discussed.
Great. Is there a second?
Second.
Great. Moved and seconded to support the plan as put together. All in favor?
Aye.
Right.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Great. So we're, it seems that Mr. Lippman is not shown up tonight. So we were, and now we've taken care of these sort of two other issues. The sort of big issue that's on the agenda, right, was just sort of issues coming out of the work session last week. And I mean, I just sort of want to just take everyone's temperature, sort of where your thinking is. It seems like, I think we're all sort of in agreement, like sort of before we start like voting on things, waiting for the survey to launch and sort of then come in. But I think, are there other things as you sort of reflect on the conversation we had in that setting here on the record of things you want to bring up, or things that we could note that we want to definitely get into when we sort of start thinking of that? I'm happy to sort of use this time for whatever framing you want to do. Scott?
I'd like to, so I generally absolutely agree on waiting to vote on things until the survey comes in. I wonder if there's appetite to carve out one niche issue, which I think there is time to deal with before the next election, in which the survey doesn't ask a question about. And I got the sense that everybody was okay with equalizing the standard for how you get onto the ballot. So I've talked about this like kind of dual standard of, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you write a check, and chances are, based on our history, you don't have a primary, so that guarantees your access. And then everybody else, unaffiliated, it's not independents. Well, I guess independents too, in the sense that it's a fringe third party, but unaffiliated and third parties would petition their way onto the ballot. I'd be very comfortable making a preliminary recommendation that standard be equalized, because I think we could change it in time for the registration period for the next election, and applying the 100-person signature standard across the board. And if you want to get on the ballot, you've got to have the petition. I think I should be more clear. I think it's 100 for an aldermanic race or an alderperson's race, and it's 250 for a mayoral race.
250, yeah.
But adopting a recommendation that the standard for getting on the ballot be equalized, and that we use the petition standard for everyone, just because I think it levels the playing field. And it seemed to me that there was some consensus that we needed to level the playing field, and that there was some openness to using that standard. I think one of us said, if you really have support to run, getting the signature shouldn't be that big of a challenge. So I guess it's first a question of, would anybody else be willing to consider that as a preliminary recommendation, since the survey doesn't speak to it?
Great. Any thoughts or comments? Anybody else? We can sort of see how people feel.
I mean, I just kind of second what Scott is saying about addressing that issue for sure. I guess I'm agnostic on like the prioritization of all the issues, but I think that's something that we definitely do want to, like, as a task force, like dig into and make a recommendation on, hopefully, if we agree.
Cool. And Scott, is your thinking that you basically sort of leave the money structure in place and just add that anybody who's seeking an aldermanic seat and or the mayorship has the same signature threshold added? Yeah,
because I think my understanding, and maybe this is incorrect, is that if you petition and you still pay the filing fee,
I think that's
It's
right.
that if you are competing through a primary, you just don't have the petition requirement. So I think that's correct. It would be everybody has to get the signatures and pay the filing fee.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with that as one of the preliminary recommendations. I would just like to know what some other municipalities are doing, but I don't have an issue with it being one of the preliminary recommendations right now.
It might be helpful to find out what some other jurisdictions are doing. I think you're going to get a lot of pushback, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, like,
Yeah.
I would agree with making the recommendation. I don't see it going through. I don't see the aldermen shooting themselves in the foot like that.
Yeah, that's why I think we should see what others are doing as well. At least we have some information.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think like we talked about it at the beginning here, right? So there's two paths through which like these recommendations could be adopted, right? One is through the council adopting them, and another one through it is a ballot question, right? Which can be added through like a community support, right? Gathering signatures and that sort of thing, right? So even if all the persons might not support it, I think there's other ways to perhaps like make the adjustment. Obviously, that wouldn't work for this upcoming election. But just I think in general, when we're thinking about recommendations, like we shouldn't necessarily make them based on like what we think the other persons can support, because there's other ways to make those changes happen. So that's just point I want to add there.
Thank you. Scott?
So the challenge, I think, with the comparative approach and looking at what other municipalities do is that overwhelmingly they have purely nonpartisan elections. So the real only kind of peer municipal systems where they would have this dual standard of you can primary onto the general election ballot, or you can get on through another means, would be the city of Baltimore, which really is not a fair comparison because it operates kind of like a county based on its sheer size, and then the city of Frederick. So that
I think you might have more success by saying independents can now pay $60 to register, as opposed to getting 100 signatures, as opposed to requiring the Dem and the Republican candidates to go out and get 100 signatures.
I'd actually be okay with our recommendation be that the city council adopt either a standard that's like that, like basically you pay the $60, you're on the ballot, or you pay the $60 and get 100. Just, I mean, because I don't think one's necessarily better than the other. I just want it to be equal footing. Like, that's my concern. So I would even be open with us forming a preliminary recommendation tonight that is, the city council should equalize the standard, and here's 2 ways to achieve it.
Andrew?
I'm just curious, where did the numbers come from with respect to 100 signatures for alderpersons and then 250 for mayors? Is that written somewhere, or where did we get that from?
It's in code, and I'm actually looking at code trying to find the exact section. It's, I think, just been there. I mean, I can't remember the last time this section of, I mean, I don't know the last time this section of code was amended.
It's
I mean, sometimes things I'm under, chapter 4.20 nominations and candidacy, but it may be elsewhere.
Yeah, you would think, right? Like if the threshold is, per ward, you would think the mayor's number should be higher, right? Than not,
Well, also when you do 100, well, the wards are supposed to be somewhat equalized as far as numbers.
They're not as close as they should be, but they're
4.2 of the code.
Yeah, I've been looking through it. I can't find the specifics. Okay,
I think
4.20090. In order to have the name of a proposed candidate placed on the ballot under this section, the candidate shall file with the board petitions signed by the number of voters specified in subsection D. And so I was incorrect. A candidate for mayor shall file petitions bearing the signature of not less than 500 registered voters, of whom not less than 50 shall reside in each ward of the city. A candidate for alderman shall file petitions bearing the signatures of not less than 100 registered voters residing in the ward from which the candidate seeks nomination. And then it goes on to get some information about the signatures have to be on separate papers, the size of the paper, and that sort of thing. And then the other is, you know, you can, if you're a Democrat or a Republican, you can just file. The other piece that puts just an aside by going the signature route is that it does place the places a burden in terms of follow-up and having then having 100 signatures for every candidate that then needs to be verified.
This needs to be done before the primary, right?
Before the
If-
filing deadline,
if-
yeah. Or, you know, right, like, or before the opening of
I
this
mean,
cycle where people could file.
do unaffiliated and third parties need to file? Can they file after the primary? I mean, they're not on the primary ballot.
I'd have to check. I think.
I mean, I thought the point of, Democrats and Republicans not having to do those signatures was because they had their closed primaries, so that each party would select their person, and that the point of the signatures was, to prove that a person had the correct support, whereas it was always inferred that a Democrat or a Republican that's won their primary has that. Unless I'm missing something.
So the nomination by petition has to occur in the period that where a certificate of candidacy can be filed.
And what's the deadlines on that?
I'm scrolling now.
It's the certificate of candidacies are done like the end of July, the very end of July.
Not later than 9 p.m. on the Monday, which is 7 weeks before the day on which the primary election should be held. Under
Okay.
the primary election law.
So it
If
has
you
to be
wanna-
done.
if you
Yeah, it
wanna
has to be
run-
done before the primary.
Yeah, just because that's when they close the window of candidates, right? I guess
Yeah.
so.
Right.
But you were then, it's interesting. I mean,
I think it probably also prevents sore loser, it's a terrible term for it, but the sore
Yeah.
loser law type
You
of
lose it.
aspect.
you lose a primary, and then you basically say, I'm going to
Run as
file
a third, yeah.
I mean, so I'd be okay if we decide we want to make a preliminary recommendation that it's either path could be adopted. I'm okay with the check only path. I think looking at our history of the candidates that are drawn into the race, we average less than 2 candidates per automatic race historically. So it'd be nice to have more candidates. I don't think it's going to be an unmanageable explosion. I will apologize to the Board of Supervisors of Elections if I am wrong. It'd be nice to maybe get 4 viable candidates in a city council race.
Right, but if you're looking across the whole city for 8 wards, you're looking at a minimum of, and mayor, you're looking at a minimum of 9 candidates. So that's 900 signatures right there to review.
I'd be perfectly open to just making the recommendation of check only as the path, and that if you were registered as an unaffiliated or a third party, you can be listed on the ballot for filing the same filing fee and just eliminating the petition requirement. Which should be easy for review for the board, and if the candidate number doubled next time around from this time, I think it would still be a manageable number.
Andrew.
Hey, Scott kind of answered my question. I mean, do we think that if we lower the threshold to such an extent, we might get too many, too many folks on the ballot? Or if it's just $60 to get in, I can imagine that would get some people's attention, you could end up with even, I don't know, 10 candidates in a ward or something like that. I just don't know if we don't want to go too far the other way.
I mean, you could imagine a mayor's race, which is the place where we traditionally have the closest partisan races, and and then you got 10, 20 other people in there, each taking 0.5%. Like what is it, like? We're not serious candidates. So like, it's if you extrapolate it out, it's an interesting.
Yeah, I don't support that one. Just the money. I do the signatures preliminary, not just paying the $60.
Maybe so we just have something to actually vote on, because we kind of have the open-ended amorphous question now. I'll offer a motion of we make an interim recommendation or a preliminary recommendation that we believe the standard for getting onto the ballot needs to be equalized, and that there appears to be two paths the city could take to do that. It could either require the petition signatures of all candidates seeking to file a certificate of candidacy, or it could eliminate the petition requirement for candidates that are not covered by a primary election. So the motion is basically, we want to get to this underlying intent. We believe there are two ways to do it, and we're not making a recommendation on which way to do it.
Andrew.
Can I ask just like a clarifying question? Are we doing this as a preliminary motion because the deadline is coming up and this is an issue that needs to be addressed like urgently? What's the timeline here that is like making this a separate preliminary motion or a separate preliminary recommendation rather than part of the report?
My motivator was that we equalize, since I offered the motion, I'd say my motivator for doing this now as a preliminary is there's still time to equalize the standards for those unaffiliated and third-party citizens of Annapolis that want to run. The city council could actually adopt a bill in time that the change could be effective before the filing deadline.
So I think to that point, but I mean, you raised it in the context of because it's something that wouldn't be covered for the survey, so we could start.
Yeah, well, and that it takes away my heartburn, because since we're not asking people to give feedback on it specifically, it's not like we want your opinion, but we've already made a decision.
But realistically, it's going to travel along with whatever as the recommendations. It would just be like, here's something you could do now, immediately, right? Like versus something, right? I mean, you're not envisioning we would like vote on it and then be like, ask Eileen to be like, go share this separately, right? Like you're thinking it's just going to be sort of one piece of what the recommendations are.
I mean, it would be in the record now, which I hope would warrant some attention and maybe some discussion. So I know there are members of the city council that have kind of been concerned with the third party and unaffiliated issue in the past. I think Alderman Savage, it was reported, was affected by this early on in his political career here. So my hope is, candidly, by it being in the record, it may draw some attention.
Mm.
I don't envision a special report, but it being in the record, I think means something.
Yeah, I think I was a little bit confused because I thought, because the conversation was that we would not make the recommendations until we got the feedback from the questionnaires, and then immediately you started talking about this preliminary recommendation. So my thought was that you were talking about having this because it was not part of the survey, but even before we make our final recommendations, that this is one you wanted to put in the record now, but not travel alone. As Ian said, it would still be part of the overall recommendations.
Yeah.
So.
Let's do this. If we can sort of, put a pin in it for a second. I see Jared has joined us. So maybe we can turn to talk with him briefly, and then we can sort of come back to this conversation and pick it up if that's okay with everybody. Jared, how are you? It looks like he's there, but
yep, just
there he is.
Sorry for joining you late. My daughter had her wisdom teeth taken out this morning, and I've been on dad duty all day and had to just handle some things. I got distracted and I lost track of time. I apologize.
Not a problem. Thanks for taking a few minutes to join us.
Happy to.
So, I think sort of this came out of, and I think I mentioned this when I reached out to you, but like really obviously you just ran the ward boundary process. We think you probably took in lots of information. Theoretically, some of the things you heard or got brought forward maybe relate to sort of the purview that we have here. So we're just sort of curious if you have thoughts about that. And it struck me in thinking about it, it's a twofold thing. It's not just sort of the sort of potential policy recommendations that we might want to consider that came up through your process, but also like I know you're in the midst of trying to figure out how to get the council to adopt your recommendations, which will be part of our reality once we deliver our recommendations. So like, if you could speak sort of maybe a little bit on both of those, and I'm sure people will, we're very informal here. People will jump in and ask questions and stuff. So like, but
Sure.
With that framing, I'd like to sort of hear what your thoughts are from you and your members of your commission, and sort of where you sort of arrived at and where you started.
Sure. So for those who might not have been familiar with what the task force was, this was formed every 10 years after the census. And after the 2020 census was formed, the city finally got their results a year ago, October, and created this task force and gave it 6 months to make recommendations on what changes should be made. The starting point was what was legally required. And the legal requirements are that the populations of each ward be within 5% of each other. That was the main driver where people had to move, because Ward 2 was over and Ward 7 was under. And of course, Ward 2 does not touch Ward 7. So to get people to move from 2 to 7, you had to be a little bit of a waterfall to going into the wards that it's attached, and then so on and move down to Ward 7. There are other legal requirements that might be more obvious, that all parts of the ward have to be contiguous, that a major restriction that was not a legal requirement, but it was a practical restriction, is the entire city is broken up into what the city calls blocks. And it's not the city that's doing this, it's really the state. The state has these various blocks. And some blocks might only be 13 people. And so if you're moving people from one block to another, you're just moving 13 people. But other blocks literally are like 1,500 people. And so when a whole ward, let's just call it roughly 5,000 for purposes of this conversation, if you're moving a block of 1,500 people, obviously you're drastically changing the balances. So essentially those blocks are not movable. You need to look for the blocks that are like 13, 25, 50 people per block. Some of those blocks were not very conducive to making change. I live in Hunt Meadow, and if you're familiar with this part of Ward 5, you know that Annapolis Overlook is closer to Forest Drive. If you wanted to move Annapolis Overlook to, say, Ward 7, and then there was some reason to think about that, the way they constructed the block for Annapolis Overlook takes all of Hunt Meadow with it, because Hunt Meadow would be an orphaned block. Even though it's two separate blocks, Hunt Meadow doesn't have access to the rest of Ward 5 without going through the block. So it's a long way of saying there were some practical restrictions that, just looking at it, you might say, well, isn't it obvious this is how you should change it? That just practically speaking. And if your question is, as a lot of people ask, well, can't you change the blocks? Again, that's coming from the state. And apparently 11 years ago, because after the last time they went through this process, blanking on the woman's name from the city, made logical recommendations to the state, and they made 0 changes based on her recommendations. So it's essentially, you have to just live with those blocks. So we had a very diverse group, diverse in terms of, at least there was African American and there was white. I don't think we had Hispanic. Now I'm thinking about it. We had a representative from every ward, plus an at-large member that happened to be from Ward 2. So we had 2 people from Ward 2. And we had public hearings, which were well attended. We got a lot of good feedback. Sometimes the public hearings pointed out things that in hindsight seemed obvious, like one of the proposals would have split up the Clay Street community, and it was not our intention to do that. And which is a little bit of ironic, because as I mentioned, we had 2 people from Ward 2, where Clay Street is, and neither of them highlighted that as, hey, maybe you shouldn't propose splitting up Clay Street into 2 communities. So obviously, after that public hearing, we eliminated consideration of any plan that did that. Our fast forwarding to the end, you end up with no choice but to either move or split up one of a few communities. And it includes Truxton Heights is at the center of the city for purposes of wards. And so we were successful in not splitting up Truxton Heights, but we could not proceed without moving Truxton Heights. And the people of Truxton Heights complain that every time there's a census change, they change wards. Apparently, every other commission, it used to be a commission, now it's a task force. Not a significant difference between the two. But anyway, other previous commissions have always moved Truxton Heights. And you could, once you start diving into the issue, you see why it becomes impossible not to when you're trying to move people from one half, either left, right, up, or down. But ultimately, we had to divide one of 2 communities. One was either going to be along West Street in the south part of Ward 2, Germantown area, or the other option was splitting off the base community from Ward 4. And if you look at the map, the base community is sort of sticks out almost like an appendage. And so I'm an engineer by training. So the engineer in me hated that part of Bates sticking out like an appendage because it just doesn't make sense if you're trying to do nice even blocks. But that is an African American community. And so the choice between splitting up a white community and a Black community, the task force chose to split up the white community to keep the Black community intact. So those are some high level observations. So a couple other points. We had gone into it with other people, including myself, who was aware of the population in the city of basically it's 49% white, 23% Hispanic, 22% African American. That lines up pretty neatly in terms of we have 8 wards. And so if you want to think about it in quarters or eighths, my goal was to have the majority of each ward match the population. So ideally, we have 4 wards with majority white, 2 with majority Hispanic, and 2 with majority African American. It turns out it's nearly impossible not to have a ward with at least 1 majority Hispanic. So our concern, me and other members who wanted to make sure Hispanics had at least 1 ward, it's almost impossible not to have that happen because of the change in population. What became very tough was to have 2 of each, 2 African American, 2 Hispanic, because so many of those population groups live near each other. And so because they're intertwined, when you have focus on congruous ward boundaries, you couldn't separate out those communities very well. Also, and probably from racist history, many of the African communities were very much separated. So if you think about the Clay Street versus where Robinwood is versus in Ward 7, Harbor House and the others, they're very separate from each other. So to connect one to another, because they have to be congruous, you have to go through white communities. And so that was very difficult to try to have a more powerful vote, was our thinking, if you have a higher concentration of African Americans in one ward. So we came up with ultimately 2 proposals, and as the final vote was 5-4, 5 was obviously the majority and 4 the minority. And we ended up presenting both to the city because it was such a close vote, and it was really could have gone either way. We certainly highlighted which was the majority and which was the minority, and then we also explained why we rejected all the other maps for reasons that have come up in this conversation. So that presentation was a year ago, April, and to a council who didn't know what to do with any of that information. And so I don't think anyone told them, and maybe it was my fault for not saying, hey, and frankly, I thought I did, but maybe it wasn't heard, maybe I didn't. The next step is for you, the council, to introduce an ordinance adopting one of these 2 maps, and then you could discuss it and pass it. So I went through like 6 months, 7 months, not hearing from anybody. It did take a while to schedule a work session. So I think to find a date took like 5 months. So maybe they were waiting for the work session to schedule an ordinance, and then it was still like another 3 months that I hadn't heard anything. And so I talked to one of the council members, and it happened to be Karma, and I said, what's going on? And we explained the process. And so she introduced the resolution in January. I'm sorry, ordinance in January. It might have been February, but I think it was January. And then it got assigned to various committees, including Sheila Finlayson's, and it's been on the Rules Committee calendar agenda for many times. And Sheila's had a lot of personal family health issues, and so that agenda item has gotten postponed a number of times now until September. So I've encouraged the council to take this sooner than later, because the longer you do it, the more it becomes political. Because if you're looking at it in terms of these ward boundaries should just change based on the best interest of the city, it becomes hard to do that once you have real life candidates thinking about, well, what ward do I live in, and will I live in where the line's changing? And so I really hoped it would be done without a political overlay. I should point out, it's an important point, that whatever ward boundaries they decide on become effective with the next election, meaning that the current council members don't have to worry about the changes if they happen to live in the correct ward now and they change the lines and they don't live in the correct ward. That's not a problem. But whoever is running for office for the next election, 2025, those new ward boundaries will apply. And so they might have different, you as a candidate, you probably want to know who your constituents will be. And so you could canvass and campaign to the right people. And so you really want to get those boundaries changed before you start having these people progressing in the political sense. So is that answering your question? Is there anything else I can help add to?
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Jared. Does anyone sort of have any questions or any sort of things that they want to dig into? Andrew?
Thanks, Jared, for your work on the task force and for coming to speak with us. Historically, do you have a sense of how often or how the city council has like responded to these task force reports? Do they generally adopt one of the maps, or do they ignore it, or do they modify the maps in some way? So that would be like part one of the question. Part two of the question is, and you've kind of already touched on it, and feel free to demur if you think it's too sensitive at this point, but like, do you sense that there's the political will in the council here to adopt one of the recommended maps?
So great question. And I don't have political enough sense to not answer any question that's too politically sensitive. So feel free to ask me anything and I'll give you an honest answer, whether I should or should not, it doesn't matter. So I am not knowledgeable enough about the history. So the last one would have been the 2010. I do know that certain things got changed from that because I happen to eventually represent Ward 5. I became aware that the Crystal Spring property used to be Ward 5. And after the 2020 census, it was something, it landed in Sheila's ward, and then she was a big advocate for the project. So take that, as a series of facts, and you can draw your own conclusions of how that happens. I know she was involved in that process, and I don't say that in a negative way. I would say that to her face. She, I don't mean that negatively. She has a passion, and she pursued it, and that was her right. So I can't speak to the history. As far as the political will to do something, the good news is they have to, right? Because right now the population is too large in Ward 2, and it's too small in Ward 7. Now, if the differences are like 2-3%, and you're not talking about a lot of people with 2% of the population, you're talking like, my recollection is like 1% is say 50 people. And so they have to move like 80 people or 100 people. And you wouldn't think that's a big deal, but and that only makes it extreme. So that if you only move the bare minimum, Ward 2 would be above the average by 5%. Ward 7 would be below the average by 5%. And so now you have 10 points of a gap. To me, that would be significant as a representative. And so our goal was to try to get all of the wards as close to the mean as possible. And it wasn't possible to get to exactly 0 when you start, again, talking about those blocks. The arbitrariness, what seemed to us of those blocks, became so frustrating because, I want to be a good engineer, make it all logical and explain it. and then I prevented to because of these stupid blocks and large sizes became very frustrating. But so they have to do it. And I did the best job I possibly could. I've now presented twice. I think I presented twice to the full council in work sessions. And in both, I did my absolute best to convince them that they have to choose between these two maps, that we did everything possible. We explored every question they might have. And we did talk to them throughout the process to try to legitimately get their concerns and interests, to try to address them, knowing that they were going to be the ones to vote on this, not us. So we wanted to present something that this council could approve. And so I tried my best to explain why it's going to be a nightmare for them to try to go in. They can't make small tweaks without upsetting all the other ramifications. You move 50 people, and now all of a sudden you have all these consequences that you didn't mean to impact or create. So hopefully they adopt one of these two. I think Sheila likes the majority one, so I think she'll pursue it because it keeps Bates in Ward 4, which is her primary objective and concern.
Scott?
Thank you. And Jared, thank you for leading this task force. And you've done that several times. You're very good at leading the city through big, hard discussions. I know from the DPW task force. Perhaps a slightly more poignant version of Andrew's question, and thematically on point with like how you ended your answer to that one. Something that we're seeing grow more and more common is redistricting being taken out of the political sphere and left to the appointed citizen expert committees. Obviously, there's always a little bit of politics because some politics is going to go into the appointment of the citizen commissions. But having gone through this and, having in the back of your mind, you've kind of got to try to come up with a recommendation that's palatable, recognizing that there were some members of the council who felt very passionate about some issues that I'm going to guess made some of the line movement harder. Do you think there's value in the city actually taking politics out of the redistricting process a little bit and going to a citizen independent commission? Do you think it's possible you would have arrived at different maps if you didn't, and I won't name check anybody, but you didn't have certain influences coming from the council where you knew, you had to not necessarily cave to their interests, but at least respect it?
So ultimately, I don't think it matters because the representatives for each ward, I think, were in large matter, certainly to the extent that it matters to what the discussions were, they were in touch with the alderpersons. So the person representing Ward 4 knew Sheila's feelings and shared, whether they had the same opinions or adopted them as just coincidental, or if it was more collaborative. Either way, and I had no problem with that. They had share interest. They wanted to. This is a historic district that has been disadvantaged in numerous ways, and to the fact that they're looking to maintain some cohesion, I respect. So I truly don't mean it I don't refer to it as a derogatory way.
Yeah. So
I don't see a difference of whether it was Sheila or the person representing Ward 4 in that example. Separately, the council members are the ones who get elected and are the ones who represent their constituents. And so if we as the committee or task force came up with something that we thought was wonderful and perfect and it was forced on the city to adopt it, we're not held accountable to the public. And I think that's not necessarily a good thing. So although it's frustrating as a committee member to have your work maybe not looked at as wonderfully as you put it or thought of it yourself, those are people elected are the ones who have to hold themselves out as true representatives. And I've been on the other end of it too, where I was when we're on the council and we got recommendations for, especially I remember the Charter Commission had a number of recommendations that the committee said, thanks for your input, but we're not going to do that. And again, I could understand the frustration of the committee members, but the elected officials are the ones who are responsible.
Ellie?
Jared, you and I have talked, I think in the past about when this change takes place. And tonight you said it starts after the next election. I'm just wondering what the rationale is, considering that the next election or the next, is 2 years away, over 2 years away. And will that cause more confusion when people vote for somebody to be
Yeah.
the representative and then find out that they're not?
Well, you raised a separate point with that last comment, so let me address the first point. First, it's not up to us. We didn't decide when this becomes effective. This is just how redistricting works. So and the confusion was, I refer to it as whatever changes have to be implemented before this next election, because if the city didn't, then there'd be fair charges of that it's an improper election because they were not balanced evenly. So I was referring to this, the changes go into effect with the next election, where I guess that confusion, and so I meant what I presented to you by that. I guess that was misunderstood to mean that people campaigning for the next election will campaign, and then it'll go into effect after the election for the election after that. And I don't understand necessarily that logic, but again, it's not my choice. I was just perhaps not explaining it as well as I could, but the point is that the boundaries have to get changed, and it's only impacting on the next election. It doesn't go retrospectively. To your last point, you said, what if people go to the booth thinking they're going to elect somebody and it's not their official? It's a good point to bring up, because like the Trucks and Heist people said, oh, we love Ellie, we don't want to lose Ellie as our representative. My part response, I don't know if I necessarily articulated it because it was a public hearing, I was trying to take information in, was you're not left with no representative, you're just left with a different representative.
Right.
And so on the ballot, if you go to the proper polling place to cast your ballot, you will have a ballot with the proper person. And whether it used to be Ellie and now it's whoever gets changed to, and I'm forgetting where Truxton Heights got changed to, I think it was Ward 6, but don't hold me to that. They will go to whatever polling station they're told to by the city and the paperwork leading up to the election. And when they go to the proper location, they will see the correct people on the ballot for the new boundaries. And it'll be up to the candidates going into the election to figure out what the new boundaries mean and get the new maps and make sure they're visiting and knocking on the right door.
So that
Andrew?
occurs in 2025 or 2029? I'm so
The boundaries will, the boundaries, once adopted by the city council, and let's hope it's this year, it will be in effect for the 2025 election. So if you are the candidate for Alderman of Ward 7, you will have more people in your ward than exists today, because the boundaries will have changed, and it'll be up to you as that candidate for Ward 7 to find out where those new people live and knock on their doors.
Okay.
The way to think about that would be problematic for a candidate, right? Would be if you're taking people from Ward 8 to fill into Ward 7, because it's neighboring, and you were the Ward 8 rep who lived in that section that is now part of Ward 7, and you want to run in Ward 8. It's a problem for you, but for the rest of the constituents in the district, that they're just sort of, all the information they get from the city is you're in 7 now and not 8.
Right. As an exercise out of curiosity to see, hey, who's going to maybe support this? Once we were done, we did say, where do all the existing Alder people live? And did any of them get moved from one ward to another? And I don't think any of them were affected. Obviously, that could be different for a candidate who's not one of the sitting council members. But to your point, you got to know what ward, you got to live in the ward that you represent. So you need these boundaries to be firm to know what ward you can choose to run for.
Andrew?
Following up on Scott's question, which I think was a good one, you talked a little bit about like the benefits of having this in the hands of the council. It helps they're accountable to voters and whatnot. But do you think there are any downsides with having it in the hands of the council that would be mitigated by making it an independent commission? So I mean, up until at least like up until this last round of redistricting at the federal level, like we were in one of the most gerrymandered districts in the country, right? It's extreme partisan gerrymander. I'm not saying that's going to be happening here at the city level, but There's some issues there. And if you look at the congressional level, at the national level, when these redistricting, when states move to independent commissions, it seems to like remarkably improve that. So one issue that we've talked about and Scott has been like very good about bringing up is like a lack of competitiveness. And perhaps one of the reasons there's a lack of competitiveness is that council members can, I should say, alderpersons can draw their own districts in effect if they wanted to, right? So it makes it harder to hold them accountable in that sense. So anyway, maybe you could just talk a little bit about some of the positives that might occur if we were to move to like an independent commission, if you think there are positives.
Well, I'll start with, I don't think I'm an authority on the point in that that was not our mission. I tried to take a neutral approach to this as best I could. I was in this to get to know the city better, understand the issues, to be helpful, and not try to have a political lens on what the impacts are, just trying to have a good result. In this particular, how we ended up with Germantown getting split up, those are, you know, as Karma would, those are good people. Karma is losing constituency that was active in her campaign, that donated to her campaign. And kudos to her for recommending or having in the ordinance that she introduced the map that splits up a valuable part of Ward 2. Now, I don't know that there's a whole lot of choices, because I laid out. If you know where Ward 2 is, if you say, I'm not going to split up Clay Street, and you got to remove people from Ward 2, and it's got to be along a boundary, and it's going towards Ward 3 doesn't help because you got to go south, not towards Ward 3. You end up with not a whole lot of choice. So, although the minority map did not split up Germantown as badly as it does. So to your point, it's if Karma was looking for running for re-election, which I have no idea if she is or not, and if she was looking to what's in her best interest for run for re-election, she'd want to keep as many of those people in Ward 2. So you would eliminate that bias. Kudos for Karma for not displaying bias in her ordinance, in my mind. So yes, but so maybe there's other benefits too, and I'm sure there's pro-con. There's positives and negatives on both versions of that, of who ultimately you're going to put it in the hands of a group. And so this is where I get down to, running a business too, whether you have policies or in government, you could come up with laws. And I went into, as council members, it's really important. As a council member, my thought was really important to have good laws. You need to change the laws. And by the end of my 5 years, I thought, you know what, to some extent, it doesn't matter what the law is. It depends on who the people are. And you need to have people of integrity and who will do a good job with the opportunity that they have. And if you have great laws but bad people, you're going to have a bad result. You have a bad setup and a bad program and procedure, but you have wonderful people, they're going to get to a good result.
Jared, that sort of in that thread, I mean, so it seems like it's so interesting to me that you sort of where you ended up was having sort of competing maps that both get delivered and then sort of trying to get someone to sponsor them. I mean, my recollection the last time around, I thought it was sort of the mayor's responsibility to drop the map that came from the commission because he appointed the commission, and like that's sort of the process. But that's interesting in itself. But so maybe there is some recommendations there how to streamline that process. And the questions that are being raised about sort of having people just like you and the people on your committee who spent a lot of time and to try to come up with the best map they could that they thought would be most representative with all the different dynamics you had to do, which is sort of in this vein of trying to have it's not the map sort of in the back room of City Hall and people are coming and sort of drawing on it, right? Like it's not that. So the challenge it really is like, how do you, if there could be recommendations to make it more professionalized in that way? I mean, it seems like one would be kind of like recommending it's an up or down vote. Like, you don't get to amend it. It delivers, right. Take it, don't take it. And then you are where they are now, or some you have thoughts on that of how things in advance of 10 years from now that would make the process when a bunch of people like you got impaled to do this group that
Yeah.
would be a smarter process.
So the up or down, certainly there's a initial appeal to it, but like if it's not obvious, I was a fan of the minority map. I could certainly see the justification. I have no problem that the commission chose the majority map. I don't really have a problem with it. It was more, each ward is more condensed under the minority map. So to the extent that we had really a close call, if it was 7-1 and I was the outlier, I wouldn't have brought up the minority map. I would have said clear sense of the commission wants to do this. But because it was 5-4 and we were so close, the minority was so close to becoming the majority, and there was a last second change of vote, change of mind. I felt like if we were that close, I wanted to give the council both versions to consider. So up or down vote would not have worked in that sense, unless you said up or down on one of those two to choose from. To me, there's opportunity cost of just taking so long to decide. So they gave us 6 months to do our work, and we honored that timeline. And you know me, Ian, they said, all right, 6 months, we're going to work backwards. And these are all the things we need to do to reach that deadline. And Scott, you had that experience too. And we met our deadline, including giving everybody a chance to comment on it. And now it's been a year and 4 months since we turned in our report. Like, I would have loved to see, if you're going to give us 6 months, I'm giving you 6 months to do something and make a decision. Like, that would have been really effective. And there's opportunity cost to delaying and having all these extra meetings and committee meetings. And it's just, I've already been called twice to report, and they still want me to go back to the rules committee for my third time. Like, what else do you want me to say? I've said it, I've said it whatever I could think of. And then if there's I wouldn't be surprised if there was a fourth time they called me. Like, you all know I'm a fan of public comment, but there should be a limit. Make a decision. So that's the part I would try to streamline of, you got 6 months to make a decision once the committee returns your report, and whatever it is, and there's really no way to make that practical. There's no consequence of then violating that 6 months. So it's not a practical suggestion. But
when you have things in the code, like budget deadlines and stuff like that, things have to happen that are triggers.
Yeah.
But the trigger is at some point people need to file. The season opens to file some people to run. They need to know what ward boundaries they are. That's the practical deadline of it, which is when they started. It's just I feel like it's to try to professionalize the process and take is sort of a challenge in this dynamic. And you can see a little bit why Jared and I are not on the city council anymore. Eileen.
I was just going to say, I think you can also look at the Charter Revision Commission, which went through a similar thing. Maybe I'm being naive, but I think with this task force, it will somewhat be helped by the fact that we actually have the Board of Supervisors of Elections that can also kind of drill this in and also assist with bringing it up on a regular basis. I do know that the county Board of Elections has already asked us, when is this going to get done? Because they're going to be putting pressure on the group also. So hopefully that will help move this forward, because there are other timelines that are more legally bound.
Right.
But thanks for all your work with it, because it wasn't easy, I'm sure.
Well, it wasn't that bad. It's just trying to give everyone a chance to speak so they trying to be heard. I feel like that's really important. And it's eye-opening. That's why I actually enjoy doing each of these things. I learned something, and, I have my own perspectives in history, but it's really useful to hear other people's backgrounds and know where they're coming from. So I enjoy that part of it.
Great. Any other questions or thoughts for Jared while we have him? Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Jared.
No problem. Happy to. Sorry again for the delay. I apologize.
Tell your daughter. Hope she feels better. Yeah.
It was a little funny having her come out of the doctor's office this morning all woozy and out of it, but it's all good now. Thank you. Take care. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Jared.
Okay. So I guess we could pick up where we were on Scott.
So I had offered a motion that we record a preliminary recommendation. Again, it was to equalize the standard to get on the ballot, recognizing that there appear to be two viable paths to doing that, either adding the petition requirement to everyone who files a certificate of candidacy, or removing it and allowing everybody to file a certificate of candidacy with a filing fee alone. It did not have a second before we paused to speak with Jarrett.
So, yeah, I mean, like I can see how this is a good thing to raise in the context of probably the other things we're going to talk about, which is like, going to nonpartisan elections potentially, right? Depending where we end up, so like, you'd be like, and if you won't buy that, at least do some equity in sort of how you're treating people, who want to file. I think, I see the hesitation and, some other folks part of like, is, would it make more sense if you say, okay, we're going to a money system without a signature system, but you change the numbers, so it's not just anybody sort of as a lark with $60. It's like I'll jump in the aldermanic race just to have some fun. But
Yeah.
You got to draw the rule. You got to draw the line wherever you draw the line. But I mean, I actually think there's some utility in sort of bringing it to the council and saying, like, you realize the inequity. There's a reason why we don't see people from other parties and sort of running often in these races because of that disparity. Andrew,
Is there a way that we can just get some sort of report or get a sense of what other cities are doing? I know we talked about the fact that like a lot of them are nonpartisan and whatnot, and so there's not a lot different, but I'm just thinking about other cities, maybe even outside the state of Maryland or whatnot, because I want right now, I just don't have a sense of what the result of either one of those recommendations would be, like what it would end up, what the consequences would be on the ground, right? With the $60, would we get a whole number of candidates with the 100 signatures? Would it really make a difference? Because the DNC and the RNC have the organization, right? I can imagine it's really easy for them to get those 100 signatures for their chosen candidate, that sort of thing. So I think I 100% sympathize with this, and I'm 100% in favor of doing something on it. And even doing it early, maybe it's in the next meeting or something like that. I would just like to know more before I'd be comfortable like making a recommendation.
So I'm happy to commit before the next meeting to doing a survey of the number of candidates being drawn into other municipal races throughout Maryland. I mean, because I think my sense, and I want to qualify this as kind of gut instinct, I can't confirm this exactly, is that most of the municipal elections are nonpartisan, and so their standard really is either everyone petitions on or everyone writes a check and gets on. The city of Frederick, I looked quickly, their election code looks a lot like ours today, where it's the double standard. So they're not necessarily a good foil, but we could look at just a survey of how many candidates these other races are drawing municipal wise. I mean, I completely get the point of $60 could feel like a lark. And so maybe the council wants to address it. I just don't feel strongly enough to opine on that. I mean, anything they do that equalizes it, I see as a win. And maybe one of the things I'm sensing from everybody I've ever talked to that's been on one of these task forces is the more you frame it as here's an issue and here's possible solutions, and you counsel in your infinite wisdom do what's best to address what we think is the underlying issue. Maybe I'm deferring to that being the best path of, let them work out details that are palatable, but I can't get over, in the last 4 elections, we've only had one candidate that was neither a Democrat nor a Republican. If my memory is right, there was a report that, it affected the way Rob Savage decided to run for office. I think he originally was not affiliated as a Democrat, but chose to because of the way the system's structured. I would say that's my story. And so I just think it's something to look at. But happy to pull that survey. If Andrew, if that's responsive, if you think that would be responsive, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think any information we can get. I mean, what I would have, I guess what I would think would be the most useful thing for me, or like the useful data point for me, would be the proportion of the proportion of a given electorate that is required for signature to get on the ballot. What's the ratio of that proportion to the number of candidates on a given ballot? That's to me like the key, right? So because when we think about setting these thresholds of the number of signatures needed, and you wanted the sweet spot, it sounded like was 4 candidates for a given ward. Okay, we want to think about what is the number of signatures that would get us to 4 candidates, and at this point, I just have no idea. So it's hard to say.
And just to be fair, the only thing driving that kind of 4 candidates is the seat spot, is because that gets you 2 competitive primaries and a competitive general. Like, so there wasn't a lot of logic behind 4 other than that guarantees you 2 competitive primaries plus a competitive general.
Right. And maybe if we move to nonpartisan too, maybe that would change the number that makes sense there, right? Because we just have one primary.
Yeah, it would totally change right. You'd have to. I'm happy to reach out to MML too and see if they can, sort of give us some. Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, sort of, because you're starting with a partisan lens, like how do other folks treat that? But I'd be curious, even sort of in similar sized cities, who don't even have a sort of the partisan ways, like, as if there's some information there that'd be helpful of how they structure the money or do whatever, and sort of what, then what size fields they have in sort of recent cycles. So I'd be, I'm happy to ask for that. We'll see if they can put something together for us, but. Great. So I guess we'll collect some more information and then have this on the list of things to revisit. If everyone's okay with that. Other issues or thoughts that came out of the work session that anyone wants to, that are not related to everything that's in the survey context, that anyone wants to flag, or sort of happy to entertain that or not? Cool. Sure.
I was just going to say, I have one small administrative question, since it didn't look like there were questions about the work session, and you may have covered it because I was late. We did have one set of minutes to approve tonight that were distributed this morning.
We did it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So the other question, obviously, we have the timeline of the survey now and how that's going to roll out, which is great. What's I guess our next meeting would be what, the 26th. What's everyone's sort of appetite for meeting in August? I mean, do people have travel plans that might impact sort of availability, and we all want to think about sort of shifting around? I'm happy to. I think everyone's going to be busy potentially, but at different points. But
I'll be out of town on the 9th, which is the second Wednesday when we meet. But if we're doing it virtually, I can still participate.
Okay. Yeah, I think I may the one here on the 26th. I might be on a plane, but we'll see if it's. Need to see if that's true. But
is there? I mean, absent closing out the discussion on the issue that I raised, is there much to discuss pre the survey results coming in? And I mean, I'm not looking to get out of meetings, but I just want to ask. I mean, it seems like we've gone through all our guest speakers. We've got the issue that you said you would chat with MML about, but I just don't know what there is to discuss until the survey results come in.
Yeah, I mean, unless there's someone else that occurs to anybody they would like to hear from, or Eileen has sort of other input of things we should try and do. I mean, especially if I think I'm gonna miss it, I'm just as happy to kind of cancel the next one at the end of the month, but and then sort of pick up again in August when we start to have the survey results coming in. But does anyone feel strongly about that? Either way. I'll take that as a no. Feel strongly. What do you think, Eileen? Is there other stuff that you want to make sure we start to get into, or are we sort of
I mean,
more?
we raised a number of things at the work session. I haven't had I don't have them in front of me to go back. I think you all may want to start thinking about how you want to write the report or exactly how you want to tackle it. If there's certain areas that maybe still need more attention and a deeper dive into it as far as information to present later, it might be, that extra time might be helpful, but maybe to divide some of that up. I don't know how you want to do that, but I know there had been talk before about people having different goals and that sort of thing. So if you skip the 26th, and we met on the 9th, that's a month. We'll have some preliminary information to share on the 9th. We won't have a whole lot.
Scott?
But we'll have some.
I just remembered one of the things that we were talking about receiving is I think Ashley was going to do a side-by-side comparison of the state law and the city code. Do we know when that's anticipated?
I mean, that's a good point. I don't know. In fact, I had told her I would try to start on it, which I haven't, but I could certainly, since we have the communication plan moving forward, could probably work on that. But that would be a good thing for us to go through.
So maybe that could be, if we do that the 9th, it gives a month to get that done. I mean, it's not a small undertaking.
Right. Unfortunately, the 9th, I may not be available.
Weren't we talking about a survey deadline of the 11th?
Well, we're looking at the 7th or the 11th. Yeah. But yeah, we can, I can make the 9th work, or at least get something in, because we'll be meeting virtually. So, okay, so I can work on that, and that would give us something also to discuss on the 9th.
Yeah, we have to follow up with her about this, the legal opinion issue, right? So maybe we can sort of use that to see if we can get some clarity on her on a timeline. Andrew.
Well, one point I'll make is in the work session, I think we laid out pretty well kind of the points we want to vote on and whatnot.
Yep.
I think something that's going to take more time than we might anticipate, or always tends to take more time than I anticipate, is like the wording of the motions and whatnot that we're going to vote on. And maybe that's better for a work session rather than a meeting like this. But just something I want to put on our radar as we want to probably plan for pretty early. And we can even start and draft that wording before we receive the survey, because the survey is more about like, is there support or not, rather than the wording itself. So.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of envision, right, another work session when after we've sort of, as you're saying, so you have sort of the different planks of what we're talking about. You've sort of voted on them, but then sort of like in the period of sort of writing and sort of putting it together in the packaging, probably at the back end. So that's a good flag. But yeah, I mean, you're right. Like we need to, like, that is sort of the next step of taking all these, the issues that people put together that they want to discuss. A lot of that is what's reflected in the survey, but like how to actually phrase sort of those, what those recommendations might look like. So I guess, I'm happy to keep the 26th meeting on if we think there's some sort of things that we want to use that time for. But I'm curious. I don't know. I don't have a strong feeling either way.
How about we keep it if you think you can make it, and then if not, maybe just cancel it and regroup on the next meeting. That might be one solution.
It sounds like a plan. I'll follow up with Regina once I have that figured out. So and then make sure we sort of share that out. We'll follow up when we get some clarity a little bit on the timeline of the Office of Law on sort of that side by side thing and see what we can do there. I think that's it. So I think yeah, I mean, I think in thinking about and further out, I mean, we're probably looking the survey coming back in sort of the middle of, towards the middle of August, the results, sort of the meeting to do that. So you're probably looking at end of August, early September, probably, where you're trying, we're sort of voting on the planks of sort of recommendations and then sort of drafting them, more completely, don't you think? I mean, that's been trying to think forward into after Labor Day. But
if it would be helpful, so there's a starting point, I'd be happy to go through the minutes that I've drafted in my notes to outline kind of I assume that the report is going to say, we see this challenge, and then it'll be, here's our recommendations. But I could start with a first draft of what I think we're seeing as challenges thematically, and that way we have something to respond to. So it's not like all of us staring at a blank page, which is always the worst when you're starting these discussions, but it gives us something concrete to respond to. But I'll stop short of recommendations. It'll be here are themes of challenges that we've seen, and then assume that if we end up coalescing around those, that the recommendations will come afterwards, whether it's firm recommendations or options or whatever we end up settling on.
that's great. No, thank you for starting to dig into that. That's awesome. Cool. No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, this conversation tonight about the first recommendation has me sort of thinking a little bit about sort of the layout of that, right? Which is going to be identifying the buckets and the issues, and then on some it's here is a thing you could do relatively quickly. Here is a thing that ideally you're going to have the power to send the ballot to get more public input, right? And sort of it looks a little bit like steps. So they, instead of it sort of wrapped up in a whole package where they're just then it drops on, and they're sort of the same issue that Jared's describing, right?
Yeah.
Who wants to own that? And I mean, so I like the idea that it could sort of be, we should think more a little bit about sort of how to present it and how it has the pieces that, and the urgency, right? That, you're going to have to, by this date, if you want to do something that impacts what's happening in 25, here's the date when it has to be enacted by, because that's going to impact, the first person who wants to file. So be explicit about the timeline that they may not even be aware of, Cool. Thank you everyone for taking the time. We will definitely follow up by some email with sort of the next steps on a couple of these questions we've flagged. And thank you for Eileen and everyone who worked on the outreach survey plan. I think it's great. So we're super excited to see that. And if someone would like to make a motion, we're happy to take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Seconded.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.